The late afternoon sun hung low over Willowbrook Valley, casting long shadows across the weathered fence posts that marked the boundaries of the Double Creek Ranch. Dust motes danced in the golden light streaming through the barn door, where Marcus Hayes stood brushing down his mare, the rhythmic strokes of the brush against Clementine's coat, the only sound breaking the profound silence that had settled over his world like a heavy blanket. At 32, Marcus had grown accustomed to the quiet. It hadn't always been this way. Once, this ranch had echoed with laughter, with music drifting from the main house where his wife Emma had played piano every evening after supper. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The melodies would float across the pastures, mixing with the lowing of cattle and the evening songs of meadowlarks. But that was before the fever took her 3 winters past, before the music died with her, before Marcus had packed away the piano bench and closed the lid on the keys that now gathered dust in the front parlor. The silence had become his companion, his shield, his prison. He worked from dawn until dusk, pushing himself through the endless tasks that kept a ranch running, anything to avoid the echoing emptiness of the house that had once been filled with love and melody. His nearest neighbor, old Pete Carlson, lived 6 miles down the valley road, and Marcus had managed to avoid even that much human contact for the better part of 2 months. The sound of wagon wheels grinding against gravel pulled him from his thoughts. Marcus paused in his brushing, his weathered hands stilling against Clementine's flank. Nobody came up this way unless they were lost or looking for work, and he wasn't in the mood for either possibility. The last thing he needed was some drifter expecting hospitality or conversation. As the wagon rounded the bend near the old oak tree that marked the entrance to his property, Marcus felt his breath catch in his throat. The sight that greeted him was unlike anything he'd seen in his 32 years on this earth. A woman sat hunched on the driver's seat of what appeared to be a peddler's wagon, though calling it a wagon was generous. The contraption looked as though it had been assembled from the remnants of 3 different vehicles, held together by hope, rope, and what appeared to be considerable determination. Paint peeled from its weathered sides in long strips, and one wheel wobbled precariously with each revolution. But it wasn't the sorry state of the wagon that caught Marcus's attention. It was the woman herself. She was young, perhaps mid-20s, with auburn hair that had escaped from what might have once been a neat braid, now hanging in damp tendrils around a face pale with exhaustion. Her left leg, he noticed, was positioned awkwardly, as though bearing weight on it caused considerable pain. Dark circles shadowed her green eyes, and her lips were pressed together in a thin line that spoke of someone trying very hard not to cry. Cradled in her right arm, as tenderly as a mother might hold a child, was a small pink piglet. The creature couldn't have been more than a few weeks old, and around its neck was a peculiar collar made of what appeared to be braided leather and small silver bells that tinkled softly with each movement. The piglet's ears were alert, its bright black eyes taking in the new surroundings with intelligent curiosity. But what truly made Marcus stare was the object balanced precariously on the wagon seat beside her. It was a music box, ornate and beautiful, despite its obviously damaged state. The lid hung at an odd angle, held on by a single hinge, and through the gap, Marcus could see the delicate figurine inside, a tiny ballerina frozen mid-pirouette. Even from a distance, he could tell that something was fundamentally wrong with the mechanism, something that had silenced what should have been its song. The woman guided her struggling horse to a stop near the fence, the animal's flanks heaving with exhaustion. For a long moment, she simply sat there, as though gathering the strength for whatever came next. Then, slowly, she turned her head toward where Marcus stood in the barn doorway. "Excuse me," she called, her voice carrying despite its obvious weariness. "I'm looking for work. Any kind of work. I can cook, clean, tend animals, mend clothes." She paused, swallowing hard. "I'm not asking for charity, just a chance to earn my keep." Marcus found himself stepping out of the barn before he'd consciously decided to move. Something about the woman's dignity in the face of what was clearly desperate circumstances stirred something in his chest that he thought had died along with Emma's music. As he drew closer, he could see the extent of her exhaustion more clearly. Her dress, once a pretty blue calico, was travel-stained and mended in several places. Her boots were worn thin at the soles, and there was a tremor in her hands that spoke of someone who hadn't had a proper meal in days. The piglet in her arms shifted, making a small snuffling sound, and she automatically adjusted her hold, murmuring something soft and comforting to the creature. The tenderness of the gesture, the protective way she curved her body around the small animal, told Marcus more about her character than any words could have. "What's your name?" he found himself asking, his voice rusty from disuse. "Lily," she replied, then seemed to reconsider. "Elizabeth Lily Thornton, but most folks call me Lily." She hesitated, then added, "This is Buttercup." She indicated the piglet with a slight nod. "Buttercup?" Marcus repeated, and despite everything, he felt his mouth twitch slightly. It had been so long since anything had even approached amusing him that the sensation felt foreign. "I know it's not usual, traveling with a pig," Lily continued, mistaking his expression for disapproval. "But she's all I have left, and she's no trouble. She's clean and quiet, and she doesn't eat much." The words tumbled out in a rush, as though she'd had to defend her unusual companion many times before. Marcus's eyes moved to the broken music box, its presence incongruous among her meager possessions. "What's the story with that?" he asked, nodding toward it. Lily's hand moved protectively toward the box, though she didn't quite touch it. "It belonged to my grandmother," she said softly. "It's been in our family for 3 generations. When it worked, it played the most beautiful waltz." Her voice caught slightly. "It broke when I was leaving my last situation. Haven't been able to find anyone who knows how to fix it properly." There was pain in her voice, old pain layered beneath the fresh exhaustion. Marcus recognized it because he carried his own version of the same burden. The music box, he realized, wasn't just a broken toy to her. It was a symbol of something lost, something that had once brought joy but now served only as a reminder of silence. "You said you're looking for work," Marcus said, surprising himself by continuing the conversation. "What kind of work have you done before?" "I was a governess for the Ashford family in Denver," Lily replied, straightening slightly despite her obvious fatigue. "I taught their 3 children reading, writing, arithmetic, and music. Before that, I helped my aunt run a boarding house in Kansas City. I can manage a household, keep books, tend a garden." She paused, then added with quiet pride, "I'm a hard worker, Mr. Hayes," Marcus supplied. "Marcus Hayes. This is the Double Creek Ranch." "Mr. Hayes," Lily nodded. "I know I don't look like much right now, but I promise you, if you give me a chance, you won't regret it. I just need somewhere to rest for a few days, earn enough for supplies, and then I'll be on my way." Marcus studied her face, noting the stubborn set of her jaw despite the exhaustion, the way she held herself upright despite what was clearly a painful injury to her leg. There was steel beneath the weariness, a strength that spoke of someone who had endured much but refused to be broken by it. The rational part of his mind, the part that had kept him safe in his solitude for 3 years, told him to direct her to Pete Carlson's place or to the town 6 miles south. He didn't need complications, didn't need reminders of the life he'd lost, didn't need the sound of another woman's voice in his house. But as he looked at her, really looked at her, something Emma used to say echoed in his memory. "Music isn't just notes and melodies, Marcus," she told him once as they sat on the porch listening to her play. "It's the spaces between the notes, the silence that gives the music meaning. Without the silence, there's no rhythm, no beauty, just noise." The silence in his life had gone on too long. It had stopped being meaningful and had become simply empty. "Can you cook?" he heard himself asking. Hope flickered in Lily's green eyes. "Yes, sir. I make a fine stew, fresh bread, apple pie if you have the makings." "When's the last time you had a proper meal?" The question seemed to catch her off guard, and color rose in her pale cheeks. That's not important. I'm asking for work, not charity. It's important if I'm going to employ someone who might collapse from hunger while trying to cook my supper," Marcus said, his tone more gentle than he'd intended. Lily's shoulders sagged slightly. 2 days, she admitted quietly. "Maybe 3. Time gets a bit fuzzy when you're traveling." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Marcus felt something twist in his chest. Whatever had driven this woman to travel alone with nothing but a piglet and a broken music box Whatever had put that haunted look in her eyes and left her limping, it had been bad enough to leave her nearly starving rather than seek help. "The thing is," he said slowly, "I've got a problem here on the ranch. Been trying to solve it for months now, and I haven't been able to manage it on my own." Lily straightened, clearly sensing an opportunity. "What kind of problem?" Marcus looked toward the house, its windows dark and unwelcoming in the growing dusk. "It's the silence," he said, the words coming out rougher than he'd intended. "This place has been quiet too long. Needs someone to fix it." Understanding dawned in Lily's eyes, and with it, something that might have been compassion. She looked at the broken music box beside her, then back at Marcus. "I'm not sure I know how to fix silence," she said softly. "Neither do I," Marcus admitted. "But maybe we could figure it out together." For a long moment, they simply looked at each other, two wounded souls recognizing something familiar in the other's pain. The piglet in Lily's arms made a small sound, and the silver bells on its collar chimed softly in the evening air. "Rest here," Marcus said finally, the words feeling both foreign and right on his tongue. "Rest here, and if you can fix the silence, you'll have earned more than just wages." Lily's eyes filled with tears. She tried to blink away. "I don't know if I can," she whispered. "I don't know if you can either," Marcus replied honestly, "but I'm willing to find out if you are." The sun had nearly set now, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold that reflected off the tears on Lily's cheeks. She clutched Buttercup closer to her chest, the piglet's bells chiming again like a tiny broken song. "All right," she said, voice barely above a whisper. "All right, I'll try." Marcus nodded, then moved to help her down from the wagon. As his hands closed around her waist to support her weight, he felt the tremor that ran through her, whether from exhaustion, pain, or something else entirely. Her injured leg buckled slightly as her feet touched the ground, and she would have fallen if not for his steadying grip. "Easy," he murmured, the word coming naturally despite the years of silence. "Easy now." Lily leaned against him for just a moment, her weight slight but somehow significant against his chest. He could smell the scent of her hair, dusty from travel but with an underlying sweetness like wildflowers. It was the first time in 3 years that he'd been this close to another human being, and the sensation was both overwhelming and oddly comforting. "Thank you," she breathed, and he felt the words as much as heard them. As they stood there in the gathering dusk, Marcus became aware of sounds he hadn't noticed in months. The soft snuffling of Buttercup in Lily's arms, the distant call of a night bird, the whisper of wind through the cottonwood trees near the creek. The silence wasn't complete, he realized. It never had been. He'd simply stopped listening to anything but the emptiness. "Let's get you inside," he said, his voice gentler than it had been in years. "Get you fed and settled. Tomorrow we can start figuring out how to fix what's broken." Lily nodded, shifting Buttercup to one arm while she carefully lifted the damaged music box with the other. As they made their way slowly toward the house, Marcus found himself wondering what songs the box had once played. What melodies had filled Lily's world before whatever darkness had driven her to his door? The front porch steps creaked under their weight, a sound Marcus had grown so accustomed to that he barely noticed it anymore. But tonight, with Lily beside him, the creak seemed to carry a different note, less lonely somehow. As he opened the door to the house that had been silent for so long, Marcus caught a glimpse of something he hadn't seen in 3 years. Through the front parlor doorway he could see Emma's piano, its mahogany surface gleaming dully in the lamplight. The bench was pushed neatly beneath the keyboard, exactly as he'd left it the day after the funeral. Lily noticed his gaze and followed it, her eyes widening slightly as she took in the beautiful instrument. "Oh," she breathed, and there was something almost reverent in her voice. "What a lovely piano. Do you play?" "No," Marcus said quickly, perhaps too quickly. "My wife did. Used to. She passed." "I'm sorry," Lily said softly, and the simple words carried a weight of understanding that told Marcus she knew something about loss herself. They stood there for a moment in the doorway, the broken music box in Lily's arms and the silent piano waiting in the parlor, 2 instruments that had once made music but now served only as reminders of what had been lost. "I could make us some supper," Lily offered quietly, perhaps sensing the need to break the moment. "Kitchen's through there," Marcus said, indicating the doorway to the left of the parlor. "I'll get your things from the wagon and see to your horse." "His name is Chester," Lily said. "He's old and tired, but he's been faithful. He'll need water and grain if you have it." "I have it," Marcus assured her. "You just focus on getting some food in you. We'll sort everything else out tomorrow." As he turned to go back outside, he heard Lily's voice behind him, so soft he almost missed it. "Mr. Hayes?" He paused at the door. "Yes?" "Thank you for taking a chance on me." "On us." She shifted Buttercup in her arms, and the Piglet's bells chimed again, a tiny, sweet sound in the quiet house. Marcus nodded, not trusting his voice, and stepped back out into the night. As he unhitched Chester and led the tired horse toward the barn, he could see warm yellow light spilling from the kitchen windows, the first welcoming glow his house had shown in 3 years. Inside, he could hear the soft sounds of Lily moving about, opening cupboards, lighting the stove. Normal, domestic sounds that he'd almost forgotten existed. And underneath it all, barely audible, was the faint tinkling of silver bells as Buttercup explored her new surroundings. It wasn't music. Not yet. But it was something more than silence. As Marcus settled Chester in a stall with fresh hay and water, he found himself thinking about Emma's words, about silence and music and the spaces in between. Maybe Lily was right to doubt whether she could fix the silence that had settled over his life like dust over an unused piano. But as the scent of something wonderful began to drift from the kitchen, as he heard the soft murmur of Lily's voice talking to Buttercup, as life began to stir in the corners of his world again, Marcus thought that perhaps fixing silence wasn't about making noise. Perhaps it was about remembering that silence was only meaningful when it existed alongside sound, when it was part of a larger symphony rather than an endless empty note. Tomorrow, he would learn more about the woman who had limped into his life with a piglet wearing bells and a music box that had forgotten how to sing. Tomorrow, he would discover what had driven her to his door and what shadows she was running from. But tonight, for the first time in 3 years, Marcus Hayes fell asleep to the sound of someone else breathing in his house, to the gentle snuffling of a contented pig, and to the faint hope that silence, like music boxes and broken hearts, might be something that could be repaired. Dawn came gently to the Double Creek Ranch, filtering through the lace curtains of the guest room, where Lily had spent her first night in a real bed for over 2 weeks. She woke to unfamiliar sounds, the creak of floorboards in another part of the house, the distant lowing of cattle, and somewhere closer, the contented grunting of Buttercup, who had made herself comfortable on a pile of old quilts in the corner. The events of the previous evening felt almost dreamlike in the soft morning light. Had she really found sanctuary with a stranger who understood the weight of silence? Had Marcus Hayes truly offered her work and shelter based on nothing more than her promise to try fixing something as intangible as the quiet that had settled over his life? The broken music box sat on the small table beside her bed, its damaged lid catching the early sunlight. In the harsh reality of morning, her promise to help seemed foolishly optimistic. How could she fix the silence in another person's life when her own world had been shattered beyond recognition? The sound of boots on the front porch stairs interrupted her thoughts, followed by the gentle closing of the door. Marcus was already up, probably had been for hours if he followed the schedule of most ranchers she'd known. The realization filled her with a familiar anxiety. She needed to prove her worth, needed to show him that taking her in hadn't been a mistake. Buttercup raised her head as Lily swung her legs over the side of the bed, testing her weight on her injured limb. The pain was always worst in the mornings, a sharp reminder of that terrible night when everything had changed. She gritted her teeth and stood, determined not to let her disability become an excuse for failing at this opportunity. By the time she made it to the kitchen, moving carefully but trying not to let her limp slow her down too much, the sun had painted the eastern windows gold. The room was empty, but she could see evidence of Marcus's early morning routine. A coffee pot sat still warm on the stove, and a single cup rested in the wash basin, rinsed clean. She set about preparing breakfast with the efficiency born of years of managing other people's households. The pantry was well stocked but showed signs of a man cooking only for himself. Tins of beans, basic staples, nothing that spoke of meals prepared with care or attention. As she worked, Buttercup explored the kitchen, her silver bells providing a gentle accompaniment to the sizzle of bacon in the pan. The back door opened just as she was sliding a pan of biscuits into the oven. Marcus entered, hat in hand, his dark hair damp with sweat despite the cool morning air. He stopped short when he saw her at the stove, as though he'd forgotten overnight that he was no longer alone. "Morning," he said, his voice carrying the same rusty quality she'd noticed the evening before, as though he wasn't accustomed to using it. "Good morning, Mr. Hayes," she replied, wiping her hands on the apron she'd found hanging behind the pantry door. "I hope you don't mind that I started breakfast. I wanted to earn my keep from the first day." "Marcus," he corrected, hanging his hat on a peg by the door, "and you don't need to prove anything to me, Miss Thornton. You've had a rough time of it, that much is clear." "Lily," she returned, matching his gesture, "and I do need to prove myself. I've learned not to take kindness for granted." There was something in the way she said it that made Marcus look at her more closely. The wariness in her green eyes, the careful way she held herself, spoke of someone who had learned hard lessons about trusting too easily. "Well then, Lily," he said, moving to wash his hands at the sink. "It smells like you're off to a good start. Been a long time since this kitchen had the smell of proper cooking in it." She poured him fresh coffee, noting how he took it black and strong, like most working men she'd known. "What would you normally have for breakfast?" she asked, genuinely curious about the solitary life he'd been living. "Coffee, maybe some bread if I remember to buy it in town," Marcus admitted with something that might have been embarrassment. Not much point in cooking for one. The simple statement revealed so much about the isolation he'd imposed on himself. Lily understood it intimately. The way grief could make even basic self-care seem pointless. After her world had collapsed, she'd survived on little more than determination and whatever scraps she could find. "Well, you're not cooking for one anymore," she said, surprising herself with the boldness of the statement, "at least for as long as I'm here." Marcus settled at the kitchen table, a sturdy piece of furniture that looked as though it had been built to last generations. "How long do you think that might be?" he asked, the question carrying no pressure, only curiosity. Lily considered this as she turned the bacon, Buttercup having settled contentedly at her feet. "I don't rightly know," she answered honestly. "I was planning to head west, maybe California, start fresh somewhere nobody knows my story. But that depends on earning enough for supplies and passage." "What's in California?" The question was casual, but Lily sensed genuine interest behind it. She pulled the biscuits from the oven, golden and perfectly risen, before answering. "Nothing, really. Just the hope that distance might make the past seem smaller." "Doesn't always work that way," Marcus said quietly. She turned to look at him, seeing something in his expression that spoke of his own experience with trying to outrun pain. "No," she agreed. "I'm starting to realize that." They ate breakfast in companionable quiet, the first meal Marcus had shared with another person in 3 years. Lily had prepared simple fare, but everything was perfectly cooked, seasoned with care, presented as though it mattered. It had been so long since anyone had cared whether he ate well that he found himself eating more than he had in months. Buttercup had been given a small portion of scrambled eggs, which she consumed with evident satisfaction before curling up in a patch of sunlight streaming through the window. The silver bells on her collar caught the light, sending tiny rainbows dancing across the wall. "She's an unusual traveling companion," Marcus observed, nodding toward the piglet. "I suppose she is," Lily agreed, her face softening as she watched Buttercup. She was the runt of the litter, too small and weak to survive without help. "I've been feeding her with a bottle since she was barely bigger than my hand." "What made you choose her?" Lily was quiet for so long that Marcus thought she might not answer. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "She needed someone to protect her. And I needed someone to protect." She looked up at him, eyes bright with unshed tears. "Does that sound foolish?" "No," Marcus said firmly. "Doesn't sound foolish at all." After breakfast, Marcus showed her around the ranch, moving slowly to accommodate her injured leg, though he was careful not to make it obvious. The Double Creek was a modest operation, he explained, focusing mainly on cattle with a small herd of horses. He ran it mostly alone, hiring seasonal help only during roundup and branding time. "It's beautiful," Lily said as they stood near the creek that gave the ranch its name, watching the clear water flow over smooth stones. Buttercup had followed them, staying close to Lily's side but showing interest in every new sight and sound. Emma always said this was the prettiest spot on the whole spread, Marcus said, then seemed surprised that he'd mentioned his late wife so easily. "Tell me about her," Lily requested gently. "If you don't mind, that is." Marcus was quiet for a long moment, his eyes fixed on the flowing water. "She was like music," he said finally. "Everything she did had a kind of rhythm to it, a grace. She could make the most ordinary day feel special just by being part of it." "She played piano?" "Every evening. Said it helped her think, helped her process the day. I used to sit on the porch and listen, even when I had work to finish. Sometimes she'd play for hours, working through pieces until she had them perfect." "What was her favorite piece?" "Chopin's Minute Waltz," Marcus answered without hesitation. "She said it was like trying to catch sunlight, the way the melody danced and sparkled. She'd play it when she was happy, when she wanted to celebrate something." Lily could hear the love in his voice, but also the pain that talking about Emma still caused him. The silence must feel very heavy sometimes. "Like a weight on my chest," Marcus admitted. "There are days when I think I hear her playing, just for a moment when I'm between sleep and waking. Then I remember, and the quiet feels worse than before." They walked back toward the house in contemplative silence, Buttercup trotting between them with the contentment of a creature who had found her place in the world. As they approached the front porch, Lily's steps slowed, her gaze drawn to the windows of what was obviously the front parlor. "Would you mind if I looked at the piano?" she asked carefully. "I promise I won't touch anything you don't want me to." Marcus watched as Lily stared at the sheet music, seeing the longing in her expression. "Do you play?" "I used to," she admitted. "Before everything changed, I taught piano lessons to help support myself, played at church services, even performed at a few social gatherings. But it's been over a year since I've touched a keyboard. What happened?" The question hung in the air between them, laden with the weight of whatever story had driven Lily to his door. She turned away from the piano, her face closing off as the walls she'd built around her pain reasserted themselves. "Nothing that matters now," she said, but her hands were trembling as she moved toward the door. "I should check on Buttercup, make sure she's not getting into mischief." Marcus didn't press, recognizing the signs of someone retreating from memories too painful to share. He'd done the same thing countless times over the past 3 years, deflecting questions about Emma, about his grief, about the silence that had become his constant companion. That evening, as Lily prepared supper, she found herself humming without realizing it. The melody was half-remembered, a lullaby her grandmother had sung while teaching her the gentler pieces on the old upright piano in the farmhouse kitchen. The sound felt foreign in her throat, rusty from disuse, but somehow comforting. Marcus heard it from the front porch where he sat watching the sunset, the first music to grace his home since Emma's death. The melody was simple, almost tentative, but it carried a sweetness that made something in his chest loosen for the first time in years. When he entered the kitchen, Lily was standing at the stove, stirring something that smelled like heaven, Buttercup at her feet investigating the interesting scents rising from the pan. She stopped humming as soon as she noticed him, color rising in her cheeks. "I'm sorry," she said quickly. "I didn't realize I was making noise." "Don't apologize," Marcus said, settling at the table. "It was nice to hear. I haven't hummed in so long, I'd almost forgotten I knew how," Lily admitted, ladling stew into bowls. "Grandmother always said that music was like breathing, something that came naturally until you stopped paying attention to it. Your grandmother taught you piano?" "Among other things. She raised me after my parents died in a cholera outbreak when I was 7. She was a remarkable woman, taught me that there was beauty to be found even in the darkest times, that music could be a light when everything else seemed hopeless." Marcus accepted the bowl she offered, noting how her hands had steadied when she talked about her grandmother. This was clearly a safe memory, one untouched by whatever darkness had driven her from her previous life. "She sounds like someone Emma would have liked," he said. "I think so too. Grandmother believed that music was meant to be shared, that keeping it to yourself was like hoarding sunshine." Lily sat across from him, Buttercup having positioned herself hopefully between their chairs. "She used to say that the most beautiful songs were the ones played for an audience of one person you loved." They ate in comfortable quiet, the kind of silence that felt peaceful rather than oppressive. Outside, evening sounds began their gentle symphony. Crickets chirping, a barn owl calling from the old oak tree, the distant lowing of cattle settling for the night. After supper, as Lily washed dishes and Marcus dried them, she found herself humming again. This time she didn't stop when she noticed, and Marcus found himself almost remembering what it felt like to be content. "Lily," he said as she hung up the dish towel, "tomorrow I need to ride out to check the north pasture fence. It's not far, but it'll take most of the day. You're welcome to come along if you'd like. See more of the ranch." "I'd like that," she said, then hesitated. "But I should warn you, I'm not much of a rider anymore. My leg." She trailed off, unconsciously favoring her injured limb. "We'll take the wagon," Marcus said easily. "Chester could use a lighter day anyway, and Buttercup seems to enjoy traveling." That night, as Lily prepared for bed, she found herself looking at the broken music box again. In the lamplight, the little ballerina seemed almost alive, frozen in her eternal dance, waiting for the mechanism to work again so she could spin to whatever melody had once filled the box. She lifted the lid carefully, examining the delicate workings inside. The problem was obvious to someone who understood musical mechanisms. A spring had come loose, and one of the tiny pins that plucked the metal teeth to create the melody had been bent out of position. It was fixable, but it would require patience and the right tools. As she settled under the quilts, Buttercup curled contentedly on her bed of blankets. Lily found herself thinking about Marcus's request. "Fix the silence," he'd said. But how did one fix something so pervasive, so deeply ingrained in a person's life? Maybe, she thought drowsily, it wasn't about making noise to fill the quiet. Maybe it was about creating space for the right kind of sounds, the ones that mattered, the ones that brought joy instead of just covering pain. The next morning dawned, clear and bright, perfect weather for riding out to check fences. Lily had prepared a lunch to take with them, packing it carefully in a wicker basket Emma had once used for the same purpose. Marcus hitched Chester to the lighter wagon, one designed for passengers rather than heavy hauling. The ride through the Double Creek property was a revelation for Lily. The ranch was larger than she'd realized, encompassing rolling hills dotted with cattle, stands of cottonwood and pine, and meadows where wildflowers painted the landscape in brilliant patches of color. Buttercup rode contentedly between them, her bells chiming softly with each bump in the road. "It's like a painting," Lily murmured, as they crested a hill that offered a panoramic view of the valley below. "Emma used to say the same thing," Marcus replied. "She'd pack picnic lunches and we'd spend whole afternoons just sitting somewhere pretty, watching the world go by. You must have wonderful memories of this place." "Some of the best of my life," Marcus agreed. "But after she died, all I could see were the empty spaces where she should have been. Every beautiful spot became a reminder of what I'd lost. And now?" Marcus considered this as they descended into a grove of aspen trees, their leaves shimmering silver green in the breeze. "Now it's starting to feel less empty. Like maybe beautiful things can be beautiful again, not just painful." They spent the day working on the fence, Marcus handling the heavy repairs while Lily sorted materials and offered suggestions. She had a practical mind, he discovered, and wasn't afraid of honest work, despite her injured leg. Buttercup explored the area around them, always staying within sight but clearly enjoying the freedom to investigate new scents and sounds. During lunch, as they sat in the shade of an old pine tree, Lily finally asked the question that had been weighing on her mind. "Marcus, what happened to your wife? You don't have to tell me if it's too painful, but sometimes sharing the burden makes it lighter." Marcus was quiet for so long that Lily thought he might not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "Pneumonia. It started as just a cold, nothing that seemed serious, but it got worse, and by the time I could get the doctor out here from town, her lungs were already too damaged." "How long were you married?" 5 years. We met in town at a social dance, much like the ones they still hold every month. She was visiting from Denver, staying with her aunt for the summer. I took one look at her and knew I was going to marry her, even though I'd never spoken a word to her. Lily smiled at the image this conjured. "Love at first sight? Something like that. She used to tease me about it. Said, I looked at her like she was the answer to a question I didn't even know I'd been asking. Marcus picked up a pine cone, turning it over in his weathered hands. We had plans, you know. Children, expanding the ranch, growing old together. When she died, it felt like all the music went out of the world. I understand that feeling, Lily said softly. Something in her tone made Marcus look at her more closely. You've lost someone too. It wasn't a question, and Lily found herself nodding before she'd consciously decided to share her story. Not to death, she said carefully, but loss all the same. She was quiet for so long that Marcus thought she might stop there, but eventually she continued. I was engaged to be married. Jonathan Hartwell, a banker's son from Kansas City. Respectable family, good prospects, everything my aunt thought I should want in a husband. But you didn't love him? I thought I did. He was charming, attentive, everything a young woman dreams of in a suitor. We were planning a spring wedding, had already sent out invitations, chosen flowers for the church. Lily's voice grew distant, as though she were seeing the events from very far away. What happened? I discovered that his idea of marriage was very different from mine. He expected me to give up teaching, give up music, become the perfect society wife who existed only to make him look good. But more than that. She paused, her hands clenching in her lap. He had a temper. A cruel streak that he hid well in public, but showed freely in private. Marcus felt a cold anger begin to build in his chest. He hurt you. Not at first. It started with harsh words, criticism disguised as helpful suggestions. But as the wedding grew closer, he became more controlling, more demanding. The night, I finally realized what kind of man he really was. Lily touched her injured leg unconsciously. I tried to leave, to call off the engagement. He didn't take it well. He caused your injury. He pushed me down a flight of stairs, Lily said matter-of-factly, as though discussing the weather. Told everyone afterwards that I'd fallen, that the shock of our broken engagement had made me clumsy. By the time I was healed enough to travel, my reputation was ruined. A woman who breaks an engagement so close to the wedding, who can't even walk properly anymore, isn't exactly a catch in polite society. Marcus felt his hands clenching into fists. The thought of someone hurting this gentle woman, of deliberately damaging her leg and then destroying her reputation, filled him with a rage he hadn't felt since Emma's death. So you left Kansas City. I had no choice. My aunt made it clear that I was no longer welcome in her home, not after the scandal. I took what little money I had saved, bought a train ticket to Denver, and tried to start over as a governess. But word travels, especially about young women with questionable histories. The Ashford family were kind to me at first. The children loved their lessons, and I thought I'd finally found a place where I could build a new life. But when Mrs. Ashford learned about my broken engagement, about the circumstances that had brought me to Denver, she decided I was a corrupting influence on her daughters. Lily's voice grew bitter. Apparently a woman who would abandon her fiancé so close to the wedding couldn't be trusted around impressionable young girls. She dismissed me without references, made sure that no other respectable family in Denver would hire me. That's when you decided to head west. With nowhere else to go and no prospects, what choice did I have? I sold everything I owned except my grandmother's music box, bought the wagon in Chester, and started looking for some place far enough away that my past couldn't follow me. Marcus understood now why she'd arrived at his door looking so lost, so desperate. She hadn't just been traveling, she'd been fleeing from a life that had collapsed around her through no fault of her own. How did you end up with Buttercup? For the first time since beginning her story, Lily smiled. I found her 3 days outside of Denver. Her mother had been killed by wolves, and she was the only survivor of the litter. She was so tiny, so helpless, and something about her reminded me of myself. Two creatures nobody wanted, both just trying to survive. Marcus looked at Buttercup, who was contentedly rooting around in the pine needles, her silver bells catching the afternoon sunlight. You saved each other. In a way, yes, she gave me something to care for besides my own misery, and I gave her a chance to live. It seemed like a fair trade. They sat in comfortable silence after that, both lost in their own thoughts. Finally, Marcus stood and began gathering their lunch things. We should head back. Storm clouds are building over the mountains. As they packed up the wagon, Lily found herself feeling lighter than she had in months. Sharing her story, having someone listen without judgment, had lifted a weight from her shoulders that she'd carried for so long she'd forgotten what it felt like to be without it. The ride back to the ranch house was peaceful, accompanied by the distant rumble of thunder and the increasingly frequent chiming of Buttercup's bells as the wagon bounced over the uneven ground. As they crested the last hill before home, Lily turned to look at Marcus. "Thank you," she said simply. "For what?" "For listening. For not judging me. For giving me a chance when no one else would." Marcus met her eyes, seeing the gratitude there, but also something else. Something that looked like hope. "Thank you for trusting me with your story. I know it couldn't have been easy to tell." "It wasn't," Lily admitted. "But I'm glad I did. Secrets have a way of growing heavier, the longer you carry them alone." As they pulled into the yard, the first fat raindrops began to fall, pattering against the wagon's canvas top. Marcus hurried to unhitch Chester and get him into the barn, while Lily gathered Buttercup and their belongings, limping quickly toward the house. By the time they were both inside, the storm had arrived in earnest, rain drumming against the windows and lightning illuminating the parlor in brief, brilliant flashes. They stood in the kitchen, both slightly breathless from their rush to beat the weather, and suddenly Lily began to laugh. It started as a small chuckle, but grew into genuine, joyful laughter, the kind that comes from a release of tension and the simple pleasure of being warm and dry and safe. Marcus found himself laughing too, caught up in her infectious mirth, and for a moment the house filled with a sound it hadn't heard in 3 years. When their laughter finally subsided, they looked at each other with something like wonder, as though they'd both rediscovered something they'd thought was lost forever. "I should start dinner," Lily said eventually, but she made no move toward the stove. "It can wait," Marcus replied. "The storm won't last long." They remained standing there in the kitchen, listening to the rain and the distant thunder, both aware that something had changed between them during their day together. The careful politeness of strangers had given way to something deeper, an understanding born of shared pain and the beginnings of mutual trust. Outside, the storm raged on, but inside the house that had been silent for so long, 2 wounded souls had begun the delicate process of healing, one story, one shared moment at a time. The storm had passed during the night, leaving the world washed clean and sparkling in the morning sun. Lily woke to the sound of water dripping from the eaves and Buttercup's contented snuffling as the Piglet investigated a patch of sunlight streaming through the window. For the first time in months, she felt truly rested, as though sharing her story with Marcus had somehow eased the nightmares that usually plagued her sleep. She dressed quickly and made her way to the kitchen, where she found Marcus already at the table with his coffee, staring thoughtfully out the window at the rain-soaked landscape. He looked up as she entered, and she noticed that some of the deep lines around his eyes seemed less pronounced this morning. "Sleep well?" he asked, rising to pour her coffee from the pot on the stove. "Better than I have in a long time," she admitted, accepting the cup gratefully. "Something about telling the truth seems to have settled my mind." They fell into their morning routine with an ease that surprised them both. Lily prepared breakfast, while Marcus saw to the animals, their movements around each other natural and comfortable. When he returned, she had eggs, bacon, and fresh biscuits waiting, along with a small portion for Buttercup, who had taken to expecting her morning meal at the same time as the humans. "I've been thinking about what you said yesterday," Marcus said as they ate, "about your grandmother's music box being broken when you left Kansas City." Lily glanced toward the guest room where the damaged instrument sat on her bedside table. "It happened during the struggle with Jonathan. When I tried to leave, I was carrying it along with my other belongings. It fell down the stairs with me. Have you tried to fix it? I wouldn't know where to begin. It's such a delicate mechanism, and I'm afraid of making it worse." She paused, then added quietly, "Sometimes I think it's fitting that it's broken, like it reflects what happened to my life." Marcus set down his fork, studying her face with an intensity that made her cheeks warm. "What if I told you I think it can be repaired?" "Do you know something about music boxes?" "Not music boxes specifically, but mechanical things in general. Had to learn to fix whatever broke around here, since the nearest repair shop is 2 days' ride to Denver." He leaned back in his chair. "Emma's sewing machine broke once, and I managed to get it working again. clock mechanisms, farm equipment, even helped old Pete Carlson fix his wife's jewelry box a few years back. Hope flickered in Lily's chest, fragile as a candle flame. You think you could look at it? If you'd trust me to try. Can't promise anything, but I'd be willing to examine it, see what's wrong. After breakfast, Lily carefully carried the music box to the kitchen table, where the morning light would give Marcus the best view of the internal mechanism. Her hands trembled slightly as she lifted the damaged lid, revealing the intricate brass workings inside. Marcus examined it carefully, his weathered fingers surprisingly gentle as he traced the tiny gears and springs. "Here's the problem," he said after several minutes. "This spring has come loose from its anchor point, and this pin here is bent out of alignment. It's delicate work, but not impossible." "What would you need to fix it? Small pliers, a magnifying glass, steady hands, and patience." "I've got all of those." He looked up at her, seeing the hope and fear warring in her expression. "But I want you to understand, if I make a mistake, I could damage it beyond repair." Lily was quiet for a long moment, her gaze fixed on the tiny ballerina frozen in mid-dance. "My grandmother used to say that some things are more broken by being left alone than by trying to heal them, even if the healing doesn't go perfectly." Wise woman, she was. And I think she'd rather her music box had a chance to sing again, even if the song came out a little different than before. Marcus nodded slowly. "Then let's see what we can do." He gathered his tools from the workshop behind the barn, returning with a collection of small implements and a magnifying glass mounted on an adjustable stand. Lily watched, fascinated, as he worked with painstaking care to reattach the loose spring and carefully bend the displaced pin back into position. Buttercup seemed to sense the importance of the moment, settling quietly at Lily's feet instead of her usual exploration of the kitchen. The only sounds were the gentle ticking of the mantel clock and Marcus's occasional soft exclamations as he navigated the intricate mechanism. "There," he said finally, straightening back from his work. "I think that should do it. Want to try winding it?" Lily's hands shook as she reached for the small key that had been tucked inside the box. She inserted it into the mechanism and turned it slowly, feeling the resistance that meant the spring was taking tension. When she could turn it no more, she carefully released the winding mechanism. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, slowly, the tiny ballerina began to turn, and the first sweet notes of a waltz filled the kitchen. The melody was tentative at first, as though the mechanism was remembering how to work, but gradually it gained strength and clarity. Lily's eyes filled with tears as the familiar tune her grandmother had played so many times filled the air. It wasn't quite perfect. There was a slight hesitation in the rhythm where the damaged pin had been repaired, giving the music a subtle syncopation that hadn't been there before. But it was beautiful in its imperfection, a song that had learned to accommodate its own healing. "Oh, Marcus," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "It's wonderful. It's absolutely wonderful." Marcus felt his throat tighten as he watched tears of joy stream down her face. When was the last time he'd been able to give someone such happiness? When had he last felt the satisfaction of taking something broken and making it whole again? "It sounds different than it did before," he said, concerned that she might be disappointed by the slight change in rhythm. "It sounds like it's been through something and survived," Lily replied, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand. "Like it's stronger for having been broken and mended." They sat listening to the music box play through its full melody twice before the spring wound down and the ballerina slowed to a stop. In the silence that followed, both of them seemed to realize that something significant had just occurred. It wasn't just a music box that had been repaired. "Thank you," Lily said softly, "for taking the time, for caring enough to try, for giving me back a piece of my grandmother. Thank you for trusting me with something so precious to you." The moment stretched between them, loaded with unspoken feelings and possibilities. Then Buttercup chose that instant to investigate something under the table, her bells chiming as she moved. And the spell was gently broken. "I should check on the cattle in the south pasture," Marcus said, though he made no immediate move to leave. "And I should start on the laundry," Lily agreed, though she remained seated at the table. Finally, Marcus stood, but instead of heading for the door, he moved toward the parlor. "Lily," he said, pausing at the threshold, "would you come with me for a moment?" Curious, she followed him into the room where Emma's piano sat silent and dusty in the afternoon light. Marcus walked to the bench and, for the first time in 3 years, lifted the keyboard cover. The keys were yellowed with age and neglect, but the instrument was still beautiful. "I've been thinking about what you said yesterday, about music being meant to be shared," he said without looking at her. "About beautiful songs being played for an audience of one person you love." Lily's heart began to beat faster. "Marcus? I want to hear you play," he said simply. "Not because the silence needs fixing, but because you have music in you and it seems wrong to keep it locked away. I haven't played in over a year. My fingers will be clumsy and the piano hasn't been tuned. I don't care if every note is perfect. I just want to hear what music sounds like in this room again." Lily approached the piano with the same reverence she'd shown when she first saw it. Her fingers hovered over the keys for a moment, before pressing down gently, producing a chord that was slightly flat, but still recognizably beautiful. She winced at the sound. "It's terribly out of tune. Play anyway." She began with something simple, a folk melody her grandmother had taught her when she was barely tall enough to reach the pedals. Her fingers were indeed clumsy at first, stumbling over passages she'd once known by heart. But gradually, muscle memory began to reassert itself, and the music became more confident. Marcus sat in Emma's chair by the window, watching Lily's face as she played. He could see the exact moment when she stopped thinking about the out-of-tune keys and the dusty bench and simply lost herself in the music. Her expression grew peaceful, almost transported, and he understood why Emma had loved playing so much. When the folk melody ended, Lily moved on to something more complex, a Chopin piece that made her fingers dance across the keys despite their rustiness. The piano's poor tuning seemed to matter less and less as the music filled the room, chasing away 3 years of silence with something far more powerful than noise. Marcus found himself thinking of Emma, but for the first time since her death, the thoughts brought more comfort than pain. She would have loved this, he realized. She would have been delighted to know that her piano was making music again, that someone else had found joy in the keys she'd treasured. Lily finished the Chopin and moved seamlessly into the piece Marcus recognized from Emma's sheet music, For Elise. But where Emma had played it with classical precision, Lily's interpretation was more emotional, more personal. She played it like a conversation with an old friend, just as she'd described her grandmother's approach to the piece. When the final notes faded away, neither of them moved. The silence that followed wasn't the oppressive quiet that had haunted the house for 3 years. It was the natural pause that comes after music, the moment when the last echoes linger in the air before fading into memory. "That was beautiful," Marcus said finally, his voice rough with emotion. "The piano has a lovely tone, even out of tune," Lily replied, her hands still resting on the keys. "Emma chose well. She'd be happy to know it's being played again. She always said instruments were meant to make music, not gather dust." Lily turned on the bench to face him. "Marcus, I need to tell you something." Something in her tone made him lean forward attentively. "What is it?" "I don't want to leave. I know I said I was planning to head west, to start over in California. But being here, with you, it feels like I've already found what I was looking for." Marcus felt his heart skip a beat. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying that if you'll have me, I'd like to stay. Not as a temporary arrangement, not just until I earn enough money to move on, but permanently. As long as you'll let me." Marcus was quiet for so long that Lily began to worry she'd misread the situation, that she'd mistaken kindness for something deeper. "I understand if you're not ready for that," she began, but he held up a hand to stop her. "Lily, I need you to understand what you'd be taking on. I'm not an easy man to live with. I've spent 3 years learning how to be alone, and I might not remember how to be part of a pair. I have dark days when Emma's memory hits me like a physical blow, and I might not be the best company. And I'm a woman with a scandalous past and a permanent limp who travels with a pig." Lily replied steadily. "I have nightmares about Jonathan, days when I'm afraid to trust my own judgment about people, moments when I'm sure I'm not worthy of happiness." Marcus stood and crossed to the piano bench, sitting beside her so he could take her hands in his. "Then we'll figure it out together. The dark days, the nightmares, the fears, all of it. "You're sure?" Instead of answering with words, Marcus leaned forward and kissed her. A gentle, tentative gesture that spoke of new beginnings and hope cautiously nurtured. When they broke apart, Lily rested her forehead against his. "I love you," she whispered, the words tumbling out before she could stop them. "I love you too," Marcus replied, and the simple declaration felt like a miracle in the room where music had been reborn. Over the following weeks, they settled into a new rhythm of life that incorporated both their healing and their growing love. Marcus arranged for a piano tuner to come out from Denver, and the house filled regularly with music as Lily rediscovered her joy in playing. She taught Marcus some simple pieces, laughing gently when his large, work-roughened hands struggled with the delicate keys. Buttercup grew larger and more adventurous, her silver bells announcing her presence throughout the ranch. She seemed to understand that her role had evolved from Lily's sole companion to part of a larger family, and she took to following Marcus around during his daily chores with the same devotion she'd always shown Lily. One evening, as summer began to give way to autumn, Marcus found Lily sitting on the front porch with her repaired music box, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of gold and crimson. The tiny ballerina turned slowly to her waltz, the slight hesitation in the rhythm now familiar and somehow perfect. "Thinking about your grandmother?" he asked, settling beside her on the wooden steps. "Thinking about how strange life is," Lily replied, leaning into his warmth. "6 months ago, I thought my story was over. I was broken, alone, convinced that I'd never find a place where I belonged. And now? Now I think maybe being broken was just the beginning of a different story. Maybe the cracks are where the light gets in." Marcus wrapped his arm around her, pulling her closer as Buttercup settled contentedly at their feet, her bells chiming softly in the evening breeze. "Speaking of new stories," he said, reaching into his pocket, "I have something for you." He pulled out a small velvet box, worn smooth with age. "It was Emma's," he said, seeing Lily's eyes widen. "But before you worry about that, let me explain. Emma always said that love wasn't about replacing what was lost, but about making room for what comes next. She would want this ring to be part of a new love story, not a shrine to an old one." Lily's hands trembled as she accepted the box, opening it to reveal a simple gold band set with a small but perfectly clear diamond. "Marcus, are you asking me to marry you? I'm asking if you'd be willing to build a life with a man who's learned that silence isn't the absence of sound, but the space between notes that gives music its meaning. I'm asking if you'd help me write a new song for this old ranch." "Yes," Lily whispered, tears streaming down her face. "Yes, 1,000 times yes." As Marcus slipped the ring onto her finger, the music box wound down, and the ballerina slowed to a stop. But the silence that followed wasn't empty. It was full of possibility, of two hearts beating in rhythm, of a future that neither of them had dared to imagine when they were alone in their respective pain. That night, as they sat together at Emma's piano, Marcus playing the simple melody Lily had taught him while she added harmonies that made the music richer and more complex, they both understood that they had indeed learned how to fix silence, not by filling it with noise, but by creating space for the right sounds, the ones that mattered, the ones that spoke of love and hope and the courage to begin again. Buttercup slept peacefully at their feet, her silver bells quiet now, but ready to chime again with the next movement, the next dance, the next chapter of a story that had begun with broken things and become something beautiful in the mending. Outside, the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, and somewhere in the distance, a nightbird sang its evening song. The Double Creek Ranch was no longer silent, but filled with the gentle symphony of a life rebuilt from the pieces of two broken hearts, a melody that would play on through all the seasons yet to come. Winter arrived early at the Double Creek Ranch that year, blanketing the valley in pristine white that transformed the familiar landscape into something magical. Lily stood at the kitchen window, watching snowflakes dance in the lamplight as she kneaded dough for the evening's bread. Her engagement ring caught the golden glow, still new enough to surprise her every time she glimpsed it. 3 months had passed since Marcus proposed, and they'd planned a simple wedding for Christmas Day. The idea had come to Lily during one of their evening conversations, when Marcus mentioned how empty the holidays had felt since Emma's death. What better way to reclaim the season than to fill it with new joy, new traditions? Buttercup had grown substantially during the autumn months, though she remained devoted to her humans and still wore her silver bell collar with pride. She'd claimed a permanent spot by the kitchen fireplace, where she could supervise all household activities while staying warm during the increasingly cold nights. The sound of boots stomping on the porch announced Marcus's return from the barn, where he'd been checking on the horses before the storm intensified. He entered with a rush of cold air and snowflakes clinging to his coat, his cheeks red from the wind. "Getting worse out there," he announced, hanging his coat on the peg by the door. "Good thing we stocked up on supplies last week." "Perfect weather for staying indoors and making music," Lily replied, smiling as he crossed to warm his hands by the stove. "I've been working on that piece you requested for the wedding." Marcus had asked her to arrange a special version of the hymn they'd chosen for their ceremony, something that would blend Emma's favorite melody with a new harmony that represented their future together. It had been a challenging task, requiring her to balance respect for the past with hope for what was to come. "Would you play it for me after supper?" he asked, stealing a piece of warm bread from the loaf she'd just removed from the oven. "Of course, though you'll have to forgive any mistakes. My hands get stiff in this cold weather." That evening, as the storm raged outside and the fire crackled in the parlor fireplace, Lily sat at the piano bench with Marcus beside her. The tune she'd arranged was hauntingly beautiful, weaving Emma's beloved melody through variations that spoke of loss transformed into gratitude, of endings that became beginnings. "It's perfect," Marcus said when she finished, his voice thick with emotion. "Emma would have loved knowing her music was part of our wedding." "I hope so. I wanted to honor what she meant to you while creating something that belonged to us." Marcus took her hand, intertwining their fingers. "You've given me something I never thought I'd have again. Not just love, but the ability to remember Emma with joy instead of just pain. She's part of our story now, not a ghost haunting it." 2 weeks before Christmas, an unexpected visitor arrived at the ranch. Lily was practicing piano when she heard the sound of sleigh bells approaching through the snow. Looking out the window, she saw a familiar figure guiding a horse-drawn sleigh up the drive. "Marcus," she called, "someone's coming!" Marcus emerged from his study, where he'd been reviewing the ranch's books, and joined her at the window. The driver was bundled against the cold, but as the sleigh drew closer, they could see it was Sheriff Davidson from Pine Creek, the nearest town. "Wonder what brings him out in this weather," Marcus mused, moving to open the door. Sheriff Davidson stamped the snow from his boots before entering, his weathered face serious. "Sorry to bother you folks, especially so close to your wedding, but I have some news I thought you should hear." Lily felt her blood turn cold. Had Jonathan found her? Had her past finally caught up with the happiness she'd built here? "What kind of news?" Marcus asked, his arm moving protectively around Lily's waist. "About Jonathan Hartwell," the sheriff said, removing his hat. "The man who hurt you, Miss Thornton. He's dead." The words hit Lily like a physical blow. She sank into the nearest chair, her legs suddenly unable to support her. "Dead? How?" "Gambling debt, from what I understand. Seems he got in over his head with some unsavory characters in St. Louis. They found his body in the Missouri River 3 weeks ago." Marcus knelt beside Lily's chair, taking her trembling hands in his. "Are you all right?" "I don't know," she whispered honestly. "I thought I'd feel relieved. But instead, I just feel empty. Like the fear I've been carrying was the only thing holding me together." Sheriff Davidson shifted uncomfortably. "There's more. Seems before he died, Hartwell had been telling people you'd stolen money from him when you left Kansas City, been putting out word that you were a thief and a liar." Lily's face went pale. "But that's not true. I never took anything that wasn't mine." "I know that, and anyone who's met you would know that. But the point is, with him dead, those lies die too. Thought you should know you're free of all that now. Free to use your real name, go where you please, be who you really are." After the sheriff left, Lily sat in stunned silence while Marcus built up the fire and Buttercup pressed against her legs in wordless comfort. The news should have been liberating, but instead she felt adrift, as though a fundamental part of her identity had suddenly vanished. "Talk to me," Marcus said gently, settling beside her on the sofa. "What are you thinking?" "For over a year, I've defined myself by what I was running from," Lily said slowly. "I was the woman fleeing Jonathan Hartwell, the governess with the scandalous past, the broken creature who needed to hide. Now that he's gone, I don't know who I am anymore." "You're the woman who saved a piglet and taught her to trust again," Marcus said firmly. "You're the woman who brought music back to this house, and light back to my life. You're the woman I love, not because of your past or in spite of it, but because of who you are right now, in this moment." Lily leaned into his warmth, drawing strength from his certainty. "I'm scared, Marcus. What if without something to run from, I don't know how to move forward?" "Then we'll figure it out together. We'll create new dreams, new goals, new reasons to wake up each morning excited about what's coming." That night, Lily dreamed of Jonathan for the first time in months. But instead of the usual nightmare of being chased or cornered, she dreamed of him as a shadow that gradually faded until it disappeared entirely, leaving her standing in a field of wildflowers with music drifting on the wind. Christmas morning dawned clear and bright, with sunlight sparkling off the snow-covered landscape like diamonds scattered across white velvet. Lily woke in her room for the last time as an unmarried woman, her wedding dress hanging carefully from the wardrobe door. The dress was simple but elegant, made from ivory silk that Marcus had ordered specially from Denver. She'd sewn it herself during the long winter evenings, each stitch a meditation on the new life she was creating. The style accommodated her limp gracefully, and she'd never felt more beautiful than when she first tried it on. As she prepared for the ceremony, Lily found herself thinking of her grandmother, wishing the woman who'd raised her could be there to see this day. But in a way, she was present in the music box that now sat on the mantelpiece, its repaired mechanism playing the waltz that would accompany Lily's walk down the makeshift aisle Marcus had created in the parlor. The wedding was small and intimate, attended only by Sheriff Davidson, who'd agreed to perform the ceremony, old Pete Carlson and his wife from the neighboring ranch, and Mrs. Henderson from town, who'd helped with the cake and flowers. Buttercup wore a wreath of pine boughs around her neck, her silver bells adding their own music to the celebration. As Lily walked toward Marcus, the music box playing behind her and the piano silent in preparation for the hymn she'd arranged, she realized that this was what fixing silence truly meant. It wasn't about covering emptiness with noise, but about creating space for the sounds that mattered, the words that healed, the music that celebrated life's most precious moments. Marcus waited for her at the improvised altar they'd set up beneath the window, wearing his best suit and a smile that outshone the winter sun. When she reached him and took his offered hand, Lily felt the last of her fear dissolve. This was her home, her future, her choice. The ceremony was brief, but meaningful. They'd written their own vows, speaking words of love and commitment that acknowledged their scars while promising to help each other heal. When Sheriff Davidson pronounced them husband and wife, Marcus's kiss was gentle but sure, a promise sealed with tenderness. The celebration that followed was joyful despite its simplicity. Mrs. Henderson's cake was delicious, Pete Carlson told stories that made everyone laugh, and as the afternoon wore on, the parlor filled with the kind of warm, comfortable conversation that turns strangers into family. As evening approached and their guests prepared to leave, Lily sat at the piano and played the arrangement she'd created for their wedding. The melody soared through the house, a perfect blend of Emma's cherished tune and the new harmonies that represented Marcus and Lily's future together. When the last notes faded and their guests had departed into the snowy night, Marcus and Lily found themselves alone for the first time as husband and wife. They stood together in the parlor, surrounded by the evidence of their celebration, listening to the comfortable silence that was no longer empty but full of possibility. "So, Mrs. Hayes," Marcus said, testing out her new name with obvious pleasure, "what shall we do with our first evening as married people?" "I have an idea," Lily said, moving to the music box on the mantelpiece. She wound it carefully, and as the familiar waltz began to play, she extended her hand to her husband. "Dance with me." Marcus had never been much of a dancer, and Lily's injured leg made elaborate steps impossible, but they moved together to the music with a grace born of love rather than technique. As they swayed in the lamplight, the snow continuing to fall outside and Buttercup watching contentedly from her favorite spot by the fire, both of them understood that this was how their story was meant to end. Not with dramatic gestures or grand proclamations, but with simple happiness, quiet joy, and the profound peace that comes from finding where you belong. "I love you, Mrs. Hayes," Marcus murmured against her hair as they danced. "I love you too, Mr. Hayes," she replied, and the words felt like a song, like a prayer, like the most beautiful music she'd ever been part of. Outside, the winter wind sang through the pines, but inside the house that had once been haunted by silence, two hearts beat in perfect rhythm, creating their own symphony of love, hope, and the endless possibilities that come from choosing to heal together rather than suffer alone. The music box played on, its repaired mechanism strong and sure, the tiny ballerina spinning through her eternal dance as Marcus and Lily began the first dance of their married life, moving slowly through the golden lamplight toward all the tomorrows that awaited them. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.